let us move to Michał. Michał Wieczorek is now officially a professor at the University of Dublin. Which college? Yeah, well, I'm forgetting which college, but in Dublin. Yes, Michał has worked on AI in education and these kinds of topics for a number of years. Very recently, I think Michał said that the French position on the use of AI in education is more interesting and maybe better developed than the Irish position. So we were hoping to have Michał in France because we have more to say, right? But he was unable to make it. So he is in Ireland joining us from there. Trying to further develop the Irish position on AI in education, I guess, we'll hear from Michał about that. So thanks very much, Michał, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexei. It's very nice to be here. I'm sorry I couldn't join in person. I just started a new job at University College Dublin, and the logistics and the planning around it are still a bit of a challenge. But I'm here. Happy to talk to you about some of the research that I've been doing. I'm also very happy to follow Dagmar's presentation because I think it was an excellent talk, also about a paper that I strongly agree with. But I am going to talk primarily about primary and secondary education because this is the main focus of my research. When Sylvain asked me to present, he mentioned this literature review that I published a couple months ago together with my colleagues Mohammad Hosseini and Bert Bourdain, where we uncovered how the debate around educational AI evolved up until 2023. So the review doesn't fully cover the generative AI craze, but I think that many of the issues remain the same. Now, the paper is already out, so I don't want to spend too much time on discussing specific themes, considering also that we have a very interdisciplinary audience. I want to question what we understand as ethics in the context of research on educational AI. But just to give you a bit of a background, basically the issues that we see applying to AI anywhere, they are still present in education. AI deployed in schools is still disastrous to privacy. It is still biased. It perpetuates injustice and unfairness. For example, in the social-economic terms or geographic terms, in terms of accessibility, it inflicts many harms in regards to autonomy. It is prone to it is possible to use it as a vehicle for manipulation. It is very intransparent. Questions around accountability are problematic as well. But what is interesting about the use of AI in schools is that it affects children who are more vulnerable and more impressionable, and as such, any risks are arguably much more pronounced because children are less able to control the data that they disclose with AI tools, for example, and they might be less aware of the harms and risks perpetuated by those technologies. At the same time, while I think that university lecturers have a lot of interesting things to say about AI, we also have a lot more freedom than teachers do. And Alexei mentioned the guidance from the French Minister of Education that I praised recently. We also have terrible guidelines in Ireland that really don't answer any questions. But the issue is that teachers have to deal with that, and they very often have to follow the mandates set by national ministries or local governments or the schools themselves. Very often they end up being stuck with tools that were purchased by administrators, not necessarily for educational reasons, and they have to deal with the consequences of that, right? However, some themes that we discovered when analyzing literature are education specific, and we wanted to focus first on the arguments in favor to see what kind of benefits are invoked to promote the use of AI or justify the use of AI in schools. And promises surrounding access and inclusion are extremely prevalent, and this is also something that dealt with one of my recent papers on whether AI is going to democratize education. The idea is that with the introduction of AI tools, students who are currently excluded from getting quality education might have an easier way of doing that. For example, they might not have access to quality education because of geographic reasons or because of disability. And the idea to personalize learning or maybe introduce individuals to tutoring at scale is seen as extremely helpful to those kinds of students, right? Teachers are very often a target of edtech interventions because the companies see a lot of their work as busy work, as routine tasks that are not really valuable and are especially in need of facilitation or automation. Grading is one example, report writing, lesson planning. Those are all the things that teachers are apparently doing that are a waste of their time, according to the proponents of AI, and that AI could do for them so that they could spend a lot more time, let's say, on teaching or developing relationships with their students. This is not something that I agree with, but the argument is out there. In many papers also, the case for AI in education really boils down to the idea that it's going to improve learning outcomes or quality of education, right? That education is going to be better because of the introduction of the tool. Now, the big issue with those promises is that they are very rarely supported by evidence. Right now, there is no conclusive meta review. There are not many publications that show that an AI intervention improved learning outcomes. And more disturbingly, I would say that those optimistic narratives, they really mirror what we see in edtech marketing. It is very often an uncritical repetition of what edtech gurus, big tech companies want us to believe, right? So because of that, we found that the negative side of the debate, the critical side of the debate, is much more robust, but also very often based on evidence. We have potential benefits versus very concrete risks and harms. So for example, teaching and assessment are very ambiguous practices. We do not always know what works and why it works. And many of the inaccuracies, injustices, and biases that occur when AI is introduced to schools occur because algorithms translate very ambiguous and vague phenomena that we didn't fully understand ourselves into some rigid categories and straightforward scores that can be that can be processed by machines, right? And as such, they reduce, for example, the idea of learning or engagement, those concepts that we often use when talking about students and their experiences, into, let's say, attention, right? An attentive student, which is easy to quantify because you can track eyeball movement, that is equated to engagement. And a lot of problems occur because of that. At the same time, you're probably aware that AI is a challenge to our assessment practices. And this is something that I've spoken about recently. And you're probably all familiar with these arguments. But I think the more interesting argument as well is that the mere presence of AI as a tool that could make cheating possible, or a tool that could be used by teachers to grade students' work without actually engaging with work, is something that erodes trust. And trust is the very foundation of many of our educational practices. And this is a significant issue that will need to be addressed if we want to rely on AI as a tool for education. Another issue that I myself also engaged with is the fact that AI products are rarely based on robust pedagogies. And I have a paper coming out next month, hopefully. It's now under production, where I trace, together with Alberto Ramela from Sorbonne Nouvelle, how different narratives around AI are, and edtech in general, are really catalyzed in the kinds of products we're seeing today. But basically, there's very little evidence for the effectiveness of AI interventions, and they very often prioritize ideas about learning that are outdated, unproven, and that prioritize individual learning over communication, socialization, and group work. It is a big challenge for me now working in a school of education, where we spend 2 years teaching our master's students about social constructivism as the idea behind learning that they should be focusing on, and then they open tools created for them, apparently, that all rely on different ideas about education. For example, mastery learning, right? Extensive use of AI can also lead to the skilling, and there is a lot of discussion about the erosion of critical thinking and over-reliance on AI, especially when students use them to summarize texts that we're supposed to read, or they depend on them as writing aids. There's already some evidence showing that students might improve in very short bursts, but the moment they stop AI, their level of performance falls below the initial level. So that's already a problem, where they cannot do the things that they supposedly learn without the help of this crutch. The negative side is also much longer. I couldn't fit it in one slide as I could with the promises. So it's also worth highlighting that there is a lot of risks around the displacement of teachers, right? It is a profession that has existed for centuries now, and a lot of our social practices and communities are organized around teachers. So the displacement of such a large group would be a huge problem. But at the same time, AI also risks diminishing the role of the teacher in the classroom. If a lot of instruction would be delegated to AI tools like chatbots, how do we see teachers? How do we value their work? What is left for humans to do in the classroom, right? There is also little guidance, something that was already mentioned today by Alexei and by me as well, on how to effectively use AI tools. And a lot of the harms might occur when tools are applied for wrong purposes. Again, the example of measuring attention but framing it as a measurement of engagement is a very striking example in my view. Educators are very rarely involved in the design and the decision-making behind AI. Think about the biggest voices in EdTech right now. You have Bill Gates, Sam Altman, Sal Khan, people who have never worked a day in a classroom, right? Who have no education experience. They're very often university dropouts. And yet, they are the loudest voices talking about what learning should be and how AI can revolutionize it, right? So the decisions are very often made based on profit motives, or they're made by administrators and policymakers who buy into the claims made by EdTech companies, and they're not made based on what's best for education. And such reliance on commercial interest can also erode public control over schools, right? Even though schools are publicly funded and the public should be able to influence how and what and why we teach, as we delegate more of teaching related tasks to AI, we're going to have less control over what's happening. Now, the paper was published in 2025, but we only included papers up to 2023. So there are also some issues that came into my focus after the review was finished, and I think that warrant more attention. So if you want to do more research on this, I highly recommend looking at the time-saving promises. And this is also something that I have investigated, which grossly misunderstands what teachers' job consists of, which tasks are valuable and how they contribute to the success of teaching and learning. And they also just underestimate the time and labor costs that would be necessary to implement AI. Niels Sedlman recently published a paper together with colleagues from Sweden on the fact that teachers are actually spending more time when they include AI in their work processes, right? Teachers and students also have very unrealistic expectations of AI regarding accuracy, but also provenience of the information and the reasoning capabilities of their models, because they do think that those models reason. And very often they treat them as well as information extracting engines, similar to search engines, and not tools that merely replicate or merely generate information that's plausible. They often think that it extracts information from the web, which is not true. AI may reduce human contact, which is something that showed up in the review. But the issue is that the personal design of AI, you're talking to a chatbot that resembles a human interlocutor that can lead to problematic emotional attachments. And we've seen that with students' use of AI being particularly worrisome when it's unsupervised. And it can lead to manipulations and severe harms. A few months ago, a teenager in the US committed suicide, Adam Rain, because he was talking to ChatGPT about his mental health problems, and ChatGPT suggested that he commit suicide, and he suggested ways of doing it. And that is particularly problematic because whenever AI is introduced as a tool to be used in the classroom, it also legitimizes its use outside of the classroom, right? If we're doing it in school, it also should be fine for us to use it when we're at home, when we're talking to our friends, etc. And finally, policymakers really fall behind technological advancements. One of my criticisms of the recent Irish guidance on education AI is that it still assumes that teachers are going to use general purpose tools like ChatGPT, write a prompt, and that prompt is going to do more or less what they want, which is also a problematic assumption. But today, teachers are really inundated with products that are targeted specifically at them and that push very concrete and narrow values and pedagogies of education. To give you an example, this is what Google introduced at the end of June. And see, there is a wealth of tools that are going to do things automatically for you. You don't really have to think, just outline the lesson plan, tell the grade level, what do you want to do? You're going to have suggested learning objectives generated automatically. You have a whole lesson plan. It's going to find even videos for you from YouTube that you can incorporate in the classroom. And this is not a neutral tool. It does reflect certain ideas about learning that, as I said, they are not really the ideas about learning that we are trying to demonstrate and teach to our students when they come to initial teacher education programs, right? So those are the issues, the ethical issues that we have identified. But another theme that we really focused on is the fact that ethics and the research on educational AI are in a very complicated relationship. So there's very little work on educational AI being done by philosophers, and most of philosophers focus on higher education, which is quite understandable because this is what they engage with and this is what they know, right? However, ethics has increasingly been a key theme in research on educational AI. It's very difficult now to publish a paper on the topic without at least mentioning ethics somewhere. But some researchers seem to be skeptical of ethics, also because of reasons that Dagmar mentioned. There's a lot of ethics washing on the part of the companies, but many of them just have lots of blind spots in terms of training. They are social scientists, they're computer scientists who did not go through 5 years of philosophy as I did and then did a doctoral degree in applied ethics, right? So of course, the knowledge there might be missing. And we've seen that in the fact that many analyses are not in depth. They merely list the issues that are likely to occur. And those analyses, they do not build on clearly defined ethical theories. So it's sometimes difficult to trace the justifications for why something would be an issue or why something would be desirable. And more research is needed is a mantra that is repeated all the time in the ethics section of those papers. And this connects also to some of the feedback we got on the literature review. I promise this is not a slide where I just take revenge on the reviewers that I hated, because we tried to first send the paper to an educational journal. It was rejected there after a long time, and finally it found a home in AI and ethics. But even then, we had some pushback from the reviewers in the way we conceptualize ethics. And I have an applied ethics background. Mohammed has an applied ethics background, and Bert as well. They have even more expertise than I do. And yet, we got questions like this. Why do you go beyond privacy, fairness, accountability, transparency, etc., to discuss issues that are not ethical, right? Advantages and limitations of the use of AI are distinct from AI ethics. This is actually a direct quote, and I struggle to see what it means. Maybe that AI ethics should focus on design and not use. That is like my most comprehensible interpretation. The benefits section is not about ethics. They were suggesting for us to remove that altogether because we should only be talking about harms when talking about ethics. There are some themes that are about practical implications. For example, the impact on teacher jobs. This is not an ethical theme. Themes like limitations of technology and negative impacts on learning do not cover ethical issues. And also, there are some papers you did not include that don't refer to ethics, but ethics is a core feature of their discussion. And I think that is a problem as well, because especially social scientists are prone to discussing concerns, right, and challenges, things like that. But many themes that they cover is something that I would consider ethical. And this is not just something that I see in the reviewers' responses to what we've done, or like the comments I get sometimes when I present this work or discuss my work overall, because I see it time and time again. For example, this is a recent report from a project called Educational AI. And in the section on ethical aspects, they write, what is AI ethics? AI ethics is a branch of applied ethics concerned with questions and decisions related to the design, development of use of AI systems. So they include use. However, central themes include respect for human autonomy, fairness, transparency, and accountability. This is also the language that we're going to find in the European Commission's framing of ethics, right? Those are very technical terms. This is a great paper, and I believe that Dagmar was one of the co-authors on it. It surveyed almost 200 people working on educational AI from a critical perspective. It's a shame that I didn't get involved because I would have loved to be a part of it, but unfortunately didn't have time at the moment. I strongly recommend reading that because it really presents a very robust overview of where the research community is, what they think are the main problems, and where we should be heading further. But one of the themes that they discussed was ethics, right? Second theme to emerge was ethics. Respondents highlighted, for example, importance of how AI tends to perpetuate biases and discrimination. Critical studies should promote fairness, social justice, and privacy for all learners, regardless of their background, etc. So those are also very technical framings of what ethics as part of critical studies research should be, right? Look at the quote from one of the researchers. Critical studies aims to examine potential inequalities related to the uses and algorithms of AI, the data on which AI relies, and its biases. In the field of education, the learner must be seen as potentially impacted by the use of AI in terms of their privacy, autonomy, and the ethical questions that arise. So, for example, the impacts on their learning and experience is not something that is considered as part of the ethics of this, right? Later on, they also defined ethical concerns that were surfaced as those including issues of data privacy, consent, biases, the illusion of transparency, cost, equity, accessibility, ethical methods, and environmental impact. That was also in the context of how to do research on critical studies of artificial intelligence in education. But most interestingly for me here is that other themes that are purportedly not falling under the umbrella term of ethics are impact, right? So the way AI impacts stakeholders is not an ethical question. Or interventionism, what should we prescribe and how we should react to the impact of AI. And most puzzlingly, values and power are a theme distinct from ethics. So my suggestion would be that we cannot assess the ethical dimension of anything, and this is certainly true about education AI, without looking at how it affects our practices and communities and the values that are central to them. And this is how I think about my work, right? I have a short description in my bio that I study how EdTech influences the values, goals, and practices of education. This is what ethics is to me, right? We also cannot discuss ethics without trying to balance the benefits and harms. And this is something that those of you familiar with medical ethics would probably be familiar with, right? Do no harm, but also make sure that your work brings benefits. This is also what we see in research ethics, right? So AI that improves learning outcomes is not ethical if it also displaces teachers or erodes public control over education. Those things need to be kept in balance. Or AI that would avoid harm whatsoever would also not be ethical if it actually did not bring a tangible benefit, for example, in the experience of the students. And as a final note, and perhaps maybe an admission of guilt, because potential benefits should not be treated at the same level as the real risks and harms. And maybe that's also a challenge that you could raise in the context of the review we did, because those are two sections almost at the same level, although we try to distinguish about the factual evidence-based claims and those that are purely speculative. But because of many of the benefits are hype and speculation, and there is no conclusive evidence that AI can be effective for learning, and the risks are well documented, we should not be treating them as equal or as comparable. And my biggest concern is this is what I'm seeing happening in many policy documents, right? So for example, to again refer to the Irish guidance, they say about what AI can do, which it probably can. Most likely it cannot do all of those things, but there are certainly some benefits that are possible. But at the same time, it contrasts those with real risks and harms that need to be addressed. And they are not something to be treated in the same sentence. Thank you.